Have you ever wondered how a man could murder 93 people over 35 years and never make headlines? In the humid silence of a Kentucky homeless shelter in 2012, authorities thought they were collecting just another drifter on a drug charge. Samuel Little, 72 years old, weathered and forgotten, looked like every other discarded soul society had written off. But what they didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that they had just captured the most prolific serial killer in American history. Samuel Little didn't become famous like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. He didn't inspire documentaries or best-selling books. He was methodical, invisible, calculating in ways that allowed him to slip through every crack in the system for decades. By the time he confessed, investigators realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. This man claimed responsibility for 93 deaths across 19 states, and the FBI believes every single confession is credible. This is the story of a predator who understood something horrifying about society. He knew exactly which victims no one would look for. He knew which deaths wouldn't be investigated, and for 35 years, he was absolutely right. Samuel McDowell was born on June 7th, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, under circumstances that foreshadowed the darkness to come. His mother, Bessie Mae Little, was 16 years old and working the streets. Authorities believe she gave birth to Samuel while she was in jail. She abandoned him almost immediately, leaving him on the side of a dirt road in rural Georgia like discarded trash. Young Samuel was taken in by his grandmother, Fannie Mae McDowell, and moved to Lorain, Ohio, an industrial town where steel plants choked the sky with smoke. At 223 East 33rd Street, in a cramped house between Broadway and Elyria Avenue, Samuel grew up carrying the poison of abandonment that would infect his relationship with women forever. Even as a child, something was wrong. By his own admission, Samuel began having sexual fantasies about strangling women when he was just 5 years old. It started, he said, when he watched his kindergarten teacher touch her neck. That innocent gesture awakened something dark and permanent inside him. As he grew older, these fantasies intensified. He collected the true crime magazines, studying the methods and victims of killers who came before him. Teachers and administrators at Hawthorne Junior High School struggled with Samuel's behavior. He was disruptive, violent, and showed a chilling lack of empathy. In 1954, at 14 years old, he was sent to the Boys Industrial School in Lancaster, Ohio, for stealing a bicycle. During his year and a half there, he racked up 47 disciplinary infractions. The system that was supposed to reform him only made him more dangerous. By the late 1950s, Samuel had dropped out of high school and left Ohio behind. What followed was decades of drifting, a nomadic existence that would take him across the country and provide him with the perfect cover for murder. He became a ghost, moving from city to city, state to state, never staying anywhere long enough to attract serious attention. Samuel supported himself through theft, shoplifting, and petty crime. He had an uncanny ability to charm his way out of trouble or simply vanish before authorities could build a case. By 1975, he had been arrested 26 times across 11 states for crimes ranging from theft to assault, attempted rape, and armed robbery. Yet somehow, he always managed to slip away. During his prison stints, Samuel took up boxing. He was good at it. The controlled violence, the ability to hurt someone while making it look like sport, appealed to something dark inside him. He called himself a prize fighter, though he never pursued it professionally. Prison taught him discipline, patience, and most importantly, how to read people and manipulate them. But Samuel Little wasn't just learning to fight, he was learning to kill. In the early 1970s, as America struggled with social upheaval and changing attitudes, Samuel began his hunt. His first confirmed victim was murdered in 1970, though he claims his killing started even earlier. What made Samuel different from other serial killers was his methodology. He didn't use guns or knives. He didn't leave evidence. His preferred method was strangulation, using his bare hands to squeeze the life out of women while he watched the fear drain from their eyes. Samuel chose his victims with calculated precision. He targeted women who lived on the margins, prostitutes, drug addicts, the homeless, women of color, those struggling with mental illness. These were women whose disappearances wouldn't trigger manhunts. These were women society had already forgotten. His hunting grounds were America's forgotten corners. Skid Row in Los Angeles, the red light districts of Miami, the industrial wastelands of Detroit, the empty highways of Texas. Samuel had an intuitive understanding of geography and vulnerability. He could spot a woman who wouldn't be missed, and he struck with terrifying efficiency. The murders followed a pattern, though investigators wouldn't recognize it for decades. Samuel would approach victims with offers of money, drugs, or shelter. He was charming when he needed to be, unthreatening in appearance. Once he gained their trust, he would drive them to isolated locations. Then he would strangle them, often while sexually assaulting them. The killing was slow and deliberate. Samuel later confessed that he would sometimes let victims regain consciousness multiple times, prolonging their terror and his pleasure. After the murders, Samuel would dump the bodies in alleys, vacant lots, or remote areas. Many were never found. Others were discovered days, weeks, or months later in various stages of decomposition. Because Samuel never used weapons and was careful not to leave forensic evidence, many of his victims' deaths were ruled as drug overdoses, natural causes, or accidents. The system he exploited wasn't just social, it was institutional. In July 1987, Samuel killed Carol Alford in Los Angeles. Her body was found in an alley, nude from the waist down, strangled to death. A mother's daughter reduced to just another statistic. In September 1989, he murdered Guadalupe Apodaca at an abandoned auto repair shop. A boy playing soccer would later peer through the windows and see her corpse, an image that would haunt him forever. That same year, he strangled Audrey Everett, leaving her body to rot in the California heat. These 3 murders would eventually be his downfall, but not for another 23 years. Samuel continued killing throughout the 1990s and into the new millennium. In Cleveland, Ohio, he murdered Mary Jo Payton after picking her up at a bar near East 105th and Euclid Avenue. He described her as short and plump with brown hair. He took her to an abandoned factory, strangled her, and threw her body down a basement staircase like she was garbage. In Mississippi, he killed Nancy Carroll Stevens in Tupelo in what he claimed was his final murder in August 2005. For 35 years, Samuel Little moved through America like a plague. He drove thousands of miles, crossing state lines with impunity. Law enforcement agencies didn't communicate effectively. There was no national database to track similar murders. Samuel exploited every weakness in the system, and the system failed his victims completely. But even the most careful predators make mistakes. In 2012, authorities found Samuel at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. He was arrested on an outstanding narcotics charge and extradited to Los Angeles. It should have been routine processing of another aging vagrant, but the Los Angeles Police Department decided to run his DNA through their database. The results were shocking. Samuel's DNA matched evidence from 3 unsolved murders from the late 1980s: Carol Alford, Guadalupe Apodaca, and Audrey Everett. Suddenly, this forgotten old man became the prime suspect in multiple homicides. In 2014, Samuel Little was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial, but the evidence was overwhelming. At 74 years old, it seemed his killing days were finally over. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators. In 2018, Texas Ranger James Holland visited Samuel in his California prison cell. Holland was investigating the 1994 murder of prostitute Denise Brothers in Odessa, Texas. He thought Samuel might have information. What he discovered was far more disturbing than he could have imagined. Samuel Little didn't just confess to killing Denise Brothers. He confessed to murdering 93 women across 19 states over 35 years. And his confessions weren't vague or unreliable. They were detailed, specific, and disturbingly accurate. Samuel had a photographic memory for his victims. He could describe exactly where he met them, what they were wearing, how he killed them, and where he disposed of their bodies. He drew detailed sketches of 26 victims, portraits that were hauntingly accurate and would eventually help identify several women who had been dead for decades. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program launched a massive investigation. As they checked Samuel's confessions against unsolved cases, a terrifying pattern emerged. Time and again, his stories matched evidence from cold cases. Bodies were found exactly where he said they would be. Details that had never been released to the public aligned perfectly with his accounts. Of his 93 confessions, the FBI has confirmed at least 60 as credible, making Samuel Little the most prolific serial killer in American history. The true number may be even higher. What made Samuel's confessions so chilling wasn't just their accuracy, but his attitude. He showed no remorse, no regret. When asked why he killed so many women, he said simply that he believed no one was accounting for his victims. He was right. For decades, nobody was. Samuel told investigators that killing was synonymous with sex for him. He made the encounters long and slow as possible, savoring his victims' fear and helplessness. He viewed the women he murdered not as human beings, but as objects to be discarded. His only regret was that he couldn't remember all of their faces. The investigation revealed systemic failures that extended far beyond law enforcement. Many of Samuel's victims were women of color whose deaths weren't thoroughly investigated. Others were prostitutes and drug addicts whose disappearances were dismissed as occupational hazards. Samuel understood these prejudices and exploited them ruthlessly. In case after case, Samuel's victims were failed by a system that devalued their lives. Police departments under-resourced and overwhelmed. Coroners who ruled obvious homicides as accidental deaths. Families who couldn't get authorities to take missing loved ones seriously. Samuel Little's decades-long killing spree was enabled by society's indifference to its most vulnerable members. As investigators continued matching confessions to cold cases, more families finally learned the truth. Patricia Parker, a 30-year-old mother from Chattanooga, Tennessee, had been found dead beside a Georgia freeway in 1981. For nearly 40 years, her family had no answers. In 2019, they finally learned that Samuel Little had killed her. Yvonne Pless, identified in 2023 as Samuel's earliest known victim, was just 20 years old when he murdered her in Macon, Georgia, in 1977. She had been just another Jane Doe for 46 years until investigators finally connected her to Samuel's confessions. But for every victim identified, others remain nameless. Samuel drew portraits of women he could remember, but whose identities are still unknown. These sketches, released by the FBI, represent women who were erased from existence, not just by their killer, but by a society that never bothered to look for them. Samuel Little spent his final years in declining health, confined to a wheelchair in a California prison medical facility. He continued working with investigators, providing details about his crimes and drawing pictures of his victims. He seemed to enjoy the attention, the recognition that had eluded him during his decades of killing. On December 30th, 2020, Samuel Little died in custody at age 80. His death was met with little fanfare. There were no protesters, no vigils, no extensive media coverage. The most prolific serial killer in American history simply slipped away, just as he had lived in relative anonymity. But Samuel Little's legacy isn't just the 93 lives he claimed. It's the systematic failures that enabled him to kill for 35 years without being caught. It's the prejudices and indifference that made his victims invisible. It's the uncomfortable truth that in America, some lives matter less than others, and predators like Samuel Little understand this better than anyone. Today, investigators continue working to identify Samuel's remaining victims. The FBI maintains a website dedicated to his case, featuring his confessions, his drawings, and details about unsolved murders that may be connected to him. Families across the country still hold out hope that they might finally learn what happened to their missing loved ones. Samuel Little proved that evil doesn't always announce itself with theatrical gestures or dramatic crimes. Sometimes it moves quietly through the shadows, patient and calculating, preying on society's forgotten people. He showed us that the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who make headlines, but the ones who understand which victims no one will miss. The most terrifying thing about Samuel Little isn't the number of people he killed. It's how long he was able to do it without anyone noticing or caring. For 35 years, he moved through America's margins, hunting vulnerable women with impunity. He operated in plain sight, confident that society's indifference would protect him. And for far too long, he was absolutely right. Have you ever wondered how someone could set 2 women on fire and then calmly drive away to kill 2 more people just days later? In the humid darkness of a Florida December, as Christmas lights twinkled in suburban windows and families prepared for the holidays, evil was quietly stalking the streets of Polk County. Leon Davis Jr. looked like any other 30-year-old man trying to make ends meet. Standing 6'5" with an easy smile, he was known around Lake Wales as a former high school basketball player who loved country music and four-wheeling on weekends. But beneath that familiar exterior was something far more sinister. Between December 7th and December 13th, 2007, Leon Davis Jr. would commit 5 brutal murders in 2 separate attacks that would forever change a small Florida community. What made his crimes particularly horrifying wasn't just their savagery, but their calculated coldness. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of rage. This was methodical, deliberate evil carried out by a man who had decided that other people's lives meant nothing. Leon Davis Jr. was born on December 14th, 1977, in Lake Wales, Florida, a small town nestled between orange groves and cypress swamps in the heart of Central Florida. To most people who knew him growing up, Leon seemed like a typical kid from a working-class family. His friends described him as funny and outgoing, someone who could make people laugh and who genuinely seemed to enjoy life. At 6'5", Leon was a natural athlete who dominated on his high school basketball court. Basketball was his ticket to popularity, his way of standing out in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Teammates and coaches remember him as talented and dedicated, someone who had the physical gifts to potentially play at the next level. But even then, there were warning signs that most people chose to ignore. Leon had a temper that could flare without warning. He got into fights regularly, altercations that often brought police attention, though charges were rarely filed. There was something about his anger that seemed different from typical teenage aggression. When Leon got mad, there was a coldness in his eyes that made people uncomfortable. As he moved into adulthood, Leon struggled to find his place in the world. The basketball dreams faded as reality set in. He wasn't good enough for college ball, and small-town Florida didn't offer many opportunities for a young man without clear direction. He drifted through various jobs, never settling into anything that gave him purpose or satisfaction. In 2002, Leon and his girlfriend were arrested for shoplifting about $50 worth of merchandise from a local Walmart. It was a petty crime that seemed beneath someone of his size and presence, but it revealed something troubling about his character. Leon was willing to steal not out of desperation, but because he thought he could get away with it. By 2006, Leon's life had taken on the appearance of respectability. He married his longtime girlfriend, Victoria Campo, and they settled into what looked like a normal married life. But appearances were deceiving. Leon had purchased a house that left him over $196,000 in debt, a crushing financial burden for someone with inconsistent employment. The pressure was building, and Leon was beginning to show signs of the violence that would eventually explode. In January 2007, he wrote that on his blog, "I have hurt people in the past, and I'm sorry for it. So 2007 and on, I will live my life the right way, and that's keeping it real with my family and friends." But even as he made these promises to change, something dark was growing inside him. As 2007 progressed, Leon's financial situation became desperate. He lost his job with the city of Eagle Lake, receiving his final paycheck on December 6th. His wife, Victoria, was on leave from her job due to pregnancy complications. The family had maxed out their credit cards and fallen behind on mortgage payments. With Christmas approaching and his son's birthday coming up, Leon felt trapped by circumstances that seemed beyond his control. But Leon Davis Jr. wasn't the type of man to accept defeat quietly. Instead of looking for legal solutions to his problems, his mind turned to violence. On December 7th, 2007, he would cross a line from which there was no return. That evening, Leon drove to a BP gas station along Interstate 4 near Lake Alfred. It was a busy location, the kind of place that did steady business from travelers passing through Central Florida. Working that night were two Indian immigrants, 33-year-old Pravinkumar Patel and 55-year-old Dashrath Patel. They were hard-working men trying to build better lives for their families, men who had come to America believing in the promise of opportunity. As the two men worked outside, changing the letters on the gas station's marquee sign, Leon approached them. Surveillance cameras would later capture the beginning of what happened next, but the crucial moments occurred outside the camera's range. Leon brandished a gun and demanded money from the two clerks. What happened next revealed the true depths of Leon's callousness. Rather than simply robbing the men and fleeing, he executed them both with close-range gunshots to their heads. Pravinkumar and Dashrath died instantly, their blood pooling on the asphalt beneath the bright lights of the gas station. Leon didn't even bother to take any money. This wasn't really about robbery. This was about power, about Leon's need to feel in control when his own life was spiraling out of control. Leon calmly walked back to his car and drove away, leaving two families to discover that their loved ones would never come home. The murders were captured on surveillance video, but Leon's face wasn't clearly visible, and investigators had no immediate leads. It seemed like he had committed the perfect crime. For 6 days, Leon went about his normal life as if nothing had happened. He went home to his wife, played with his son, and maintained the facade of being a struggling but law-abiding citizen. But the taste of violence had awakened something in him that couldn't be satisfied with just one act of brutality. On December 13th, 2007, Leon decided to kill again. The Headley Nationwide Insurance Office in Lake Wales was a small, modest business run by two young women trying to make their way in the world. 26-year-old Yvonne Bustamante managed the office and had built a good relationship with many of her clients. One of those clients was Leon Davis Jr., who had visited the office before and seemed like just another local resident dealing with insurance matters. Working with Yvonne that day was 23-year-old Juanita Jane Luciano, who was 5.5 months pregnant with a baby boy she planned to name Michael. Juanita was excited about becoming a mother and had been sharing her pregnancy journey with friends and co-workers. She was the kind of person who lit up a room with her smile and genuine warmth. When Leon walked into the insurance office that afternoon, he came prepared for war. In his car, he had assembled an arsenal of terror, a .357 caliber handgun, rolls of duct tape, a can of gasoline, and a lighter. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Leon had planned this attack with the same careful attention to detail that most people put into planning a vacation. Once inside the office, Leon's demeanor changed completely. The friendly client facade disappeared, replaced by cold determination. He pulled out his gun and forced Yvonne and Juanita into the office's back room. He demanded they open the safe, which contained about $900 in cash. When the women initially refused, Leon's response was swift and brutal. Using the duct tape he had brought, Leon bound both women to chairs. Yvonne and Juanita begged for their lives, pleading with Leon to take the money and leave them alone. Juanita told him about her unborn baby, hoping that the mention of innocent life might reach whatever humanity remained in him. But Leon was beyond such appeals. What happened next was so horrific that it shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. Leon doused both women with gasoline, the liquid soaking their clothes and hair. The smell was overwhelming, and both women knew with sickening certainty what was about to happen. As they screamed and pleaded, Leon calmly lit them on fire. The flames engulfed Yvonne and Juanita instantly, their screams echoing through the small building. Somehow, the heat of the fire burned through their restraints, and both women managed to break free from their chairs. Burning and in agony, they stumbled outside seeking help, their clothes and skin still smoldering. Leon, meanwhile, forced open the cash register and safe, collecting the $900 that had been his supposed objective. But as Juanita ran for help, Leon shot her in the hand, unwilling to let her escape without one final act of cruelty. Then he calmly got in his car and drove away, leaving two women to die in agony. Both Yvonne and Juanita were rushed to the hospital with severe burns covering much of their bodies. Despite the best efforts of medical staff, their injuries were too severe. Yvonne Bustamante died on December 18th, 5 days after the attack. Juanita Luciano fought for her life longer, but succumbed to her injuries on January 8th. Her unborn son, Michael, was delivered by emergency cesarean section, but died 3 days later, another victim of Leon's brutality. Before she died, Yvonne managed to identify Leon Davis Jr. as her attacker. Her final act was ensuring that the man who had destroyed so many lives would face justice. When local television stations began showing Leon's picture, the walls began closing in around him. On December 14th, 2007, Leon's 30th birthday, he made a decision that surprised everyone. Rather than flee or try to establish an alibi, he walked into a police station and turned himself in. Some speculated that the guilt had finally overwhelmed him, but those who knew Leon suspected a different motive. He had always craved attention and recognition, and becoming a notorious killer was just another way to make people remember his name. During questioning, Leon showed no remorse for his actions. He confessed to the insurance office attack with a cold detachment that chilled investigators. When ballistics evidence linked his gun to the BP gas station murders, he admitted to those killings as well. In total, Leon Davis Jr. had murdered 5 people in the span of 1 week, including an unborn child. The trials that followed revealed the full scope of Leon's callousness. During his first trial in 2010, one of the key witnesses was an emergency medical technician who testified that Yvonne Bustamante had identified Leon as her attacker shortly before she died. The prosecution argued that Leon's crimes represented the worst kind of calculated evil, violence committed not in passion, but with deliberate planning and execution. Leon's defense team tried to paint him as a man driven to desperation by financial pressure and mental health issues. They pointed to his history of childhood abuse, bullying at school, and struggles with depression. But prosecutors argued that millions of people face financial hardship without resorting to murder, and that Leon's crimes were too calculated and brutal to be excused by external circumstances. The jury wasn't swayed by the defense's arguments. Leon was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Yvonne Bustamante, Juanita Luciano, and her unborn son Michael. He was sentenced to death on April 29, 2011. The jury voted 8-4 for the death penalty, though the judge reduced the sentence for Michael's death to life in prison. In a separate trial for the BP gas station murders, Leon waived his right to a jury and allowed the judge to decide his fate. He was convicted of murdering Pravinkumar Patel and Dashrath Patel and sentenced to death a second time. Circuit Judge Donald Jacobson noted that the aggravating circumstances far outweighed any mitigating factors, and that Leon's previous murders made him an ongoing threat to society. Throughout both trials, Leon showed little emotion or remorse. He sat quietly as victims' family members described the impact of his crimes, never acknowledging the pain he had caused or expressing any genuine regret for his actions. To him, the people he had killed seemed to be nothing more than obstacles to obtaining money, their lives holding no inherent value. Leon Davis Jr.'s case became known as the worst killing spree in Polk County history. 5 innocent people had died because one man decided that his financial problems justified taking their lives. The randomness of his victim selection made his crimes even more terrifying. These weren't people who had wronged him or stood in his way. They were simply unlucky enough to cross paths with a killer. In 2016, Leon attempted to appeal his death sentences, but the Florida Supreme Court upheld both convictions. The justices found that his crimes were too heinous and his danger to society too great to warrant any reduction in punishment. Leon Davis Jr. remains on death row at Union Correctional Institution, awaiting execution for his crimes. Today, Leon Davis Jr. is largely forgotten except by the families whose lives he destroyed and the law enforcement officers who worked his case. He doesn't have the notoriety of a Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, perhaps because his crimes lack the psychological complexity that fascinates true crime enthusiasts. Leon wasn't a master manipulator or a cunning predator who stalked victims for years. He was something arguably more terrifying, an ordinary man who simply decided that other people's lives didn't matter. The victims of Leon Davis Jr. deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Pravin Kumar and Dashrath Patel were hardworking immigrants pursuing the American dream. Yvonne Bustamante was a dedicated businesswoman building a career in her hometown. Juanita Luciano was an expectant mother looking forward to welcoming her first child. Michael Luciano never got the chance to take his first breath outside the womb. Leon Davis Jr. represents a particular kind of evil that is perhaps the most frightening of all. The evil of someone who looks completely normal, who lives among us undetected until the moment they decide to kill. He had no history of serious mental illness, no obvious signs of psychopathy, no clear indicators that would have warned people to stay away. He was just a man who, when faced with problems that millions of people deal with every day, chose murder as his solution. The case serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it simply walks into an insurance office on a December afternoon carrying duct tape and gasoline and changes lives forever. Leon Davis Jr. may not be a household name like other notorious killers, but his crimes were no less devastating to the families who lost loved ones to his calculated brutality. In the end, Leon Davis Jr.'s quest for easy money cost him everything and gained him nothing. He traded his freedom and his life for $900 and a brief moment of feeling powerful. 5 people died because one man couldn't handle the same financial pressures that millions of Americans face every day. He remains on death row, a forgotten killer whose name will fade from memory while the pain he caused echoes through generations of survivors. Leon Davis Jr. proves that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones hiding in plain sight, the ones who look like everybody else until the day they decide to kill. In the sweltering summer heat of Houston, Texas, where the air hung thick like molasses and the pavement shimmered with waves of heat that could cook an egg, children did what children always do. They played until the streetlights came on, rode their bikes through tree-lined neighborhoods, and trusted the familiar faces of their community. The Heights was one of those neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone else's business, where mothers called across fence lines and fathers gathered on front porches after work. It was 1970, and America was changing, but some places still felt safe, still felt like the innocent heartland parents dreamed of for their children. But in this seemingly peaceful corner of Houston, something was hunting, something that wore the mask of kindness and spoke in the gentle voice of a neighbor, something that offered candy to children and promises of adventure to teenagers who were just beginning to test the boundaries of their world. The children called him the Candy Man, and they had no idea that behind his gentle smile lurked one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Dean Arnold Corll was born on Christmas Eve, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and if you'd asked anyone who knew him in those early years, they would have told you he was just an ordinary boy, maybe a little shy, maybe a little different, but nothing that would set off alarm bells. His father left when Dean was 7, abandoning the family and leaving his mother to raise 2 boys alone. That same year, Dean was diagnosed with rheumatic fever, a condition that kept him from participating in sports and physical activities that other boys his age enjoyed. While his classmates ran and played, Dean sat on the sidelines watching, learning, developing the quiet observational skills that would later serve him in the most horrific ways imaginable. His mother, Mary Robinson, remarried and started a candy company called Pekin Prince, operating out of the family garage in the mid-1950s. It was here that Dean found his place, working alongside his younger brother, operating the machines that produced the confections that would later give him his nickname. He was good at it, methodical, patient, and for the first time in his life, he had a role that made him valuable. When customers came to the shop, Dean would hand out free samples to their children, watching their faces light up with delight. He was learning something important about power, about the way sweetness could be used to lure, to manipulate, to control. By the time Dean reached adulthood, he appeared to be a perfectly normal member of society. After a brief stint in the Army in the mid-1960s, where he first began to understand his homosexuality, he returned to Houston and found work as an electrician with the Houston Lighting and Power Company. He was quiet, reliable, and lived alone in a series of modest apartments and houses throughout the Heights area. Neighbors described him as friendly but solitary, the kind of man who would wave hello but rarely engaged in long conversations. He had a way of blending into the background, of becoming invisible in plain sight, and that invisibility would prove to be one of his greatest weapons. What no one knew was that by 1970, Dean Corll had begun to nurture fantasies that went far beyond the innocent pleasure he'd once taken in watching children enjoy candy. His attraction to young males had grown darker, more violent, more consuming. He wasn't just attracted to them, he wanted to possess them completely, to control every aspect of their existence, and when that control inevitably led to their deaths, he wanted to watch them die. His first victim was Jeffrey Conan, an 18-year-old college student from the University of Texas who made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride from Corll while hitchhiking in September 1970. Conan simply vanished, disappearing into the Houston heat as if he had never existed at all. His family reported him missing, but in an era when young people were constantly on the move, when the counterculture encouraged wandering and experimentation, the police filed his disappearance under the ever-expanding category of runaway cases. Jeffrey Conan became a statistic, a name on a missing persons list that would grow longer and longer as the months passed. But Corll couldn't operate alone. His victims were too numerous, his activities too complex for a single person to manage. He needed help, and he found it in the most insidious way possible, by recruiting children themselves to become his accomplices. The first was David Owen Brooks, whom Corll met in 1967 when Brooks was just 12 years old. Corll cultivated their relationship carefully, positioning himself as a father figure, a mentor, someone who understood the boy in ways his real family never could. He took Brooks on trips, bought him gifts, and gradually, over the course of months and years, introduced him to activities that would have horrified any normal adult. By 1969, when Brooks was 14, Corll had begun paying him to perform sexual acts. It was a slow descent into hell, each step carefully calculated to ensure that Brooks would be too compromised, too invested, too afraid to ever walk away. When Corll made the transition from sexual abuse to murder, Brooks was already so deeply entangled that escape seemed impossible. Corll offered him money for each victim he could lure to their deaths, and Brooks, whether out of fear, greed, or some twisted sense of loyalty, began to comply. The second accomplice was Elmer Wayne Henley, whom Corll met in 1971 when Henley was 15. Like Brooks, Henley came from a troubled background, the kind of fractured family situation that made him vulnerable to the attention of a predator like Corll. Henley was tougher than Brooks, more streetwise, but he was still just a teenager, still desperate for approval and belonging. Corll recognized that desperation and fed it, offering Henley the same combination of friendship, money, and gradually escalating participation in his crimes. The system that Corll developed was as efficient as it was horrifying. His accomplices would identify potential victims, usually teenage boys from the Heights area who were known to be runaways or troublemakers, kids whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or aggressively investigated. They would lure these boys to one of Corll's residences with promises of parties, drugs, or simply a place to hang out away from the pressures of home and school. Once inside, the victims would be subdued, either through drugs in their drinks or through physical force. What happened next defies comprehension. Corll had constructed a torture board, a plywood plank with restraints that allowed him to keep his victims alive for hours or even days while he subjected them to sexual abuse and torture that was so severe it can barely be described. He used various instruments of pain, including a large dildo with spikes attached, designed to cause maximum suffering. He would play tape recordings of previous victims' screams, not just for his own pleasure, but to terrorize the current victim with the knowledge of what was coming. The murders themselves were carried out by strangulation or shooting with a .22 caliber pistol. Corll seemed to take particular pleasure in the process of killing, often forcing his accomplices to watch, to participate, to become complicit in ways that ensured their continued silence. After death, the bodies were wrapped in plastic sheeting and buried in various locations around the Houston area. Most were interred in a rented boat storage shed in southwest Houston, where Corll and his accomplices would dig graves in the dirt floor, stack the bodies like cordwood, and cover them with lime to accelerate decomposition. Between 1970 and 1973, at least 28 young men and boys vanished into Corll's web of horror. Their ages ranged from 13 to 20, and they came from all walks of life, though many were from troubled backgrounds or were considered throwaway kids by a society that was all too willing to write them off as runaways. Each disappearance was a tragedy that rippled through families and communities, but because the victims fit certain profiles, because they were often seen as problems rather than children in need of protection, their cases received minimal attention from authorities. The Houston Police Department, overwhelmed by rising crime rates and operating under budgets and attitudes that reflected the social prejudices of the time, was quick to classify missing teenagers as runaways. Parents who tried to report their children missing were often told to wait, to assume their kids would come home on their own, to stop wasting police resources on what were likely just normal teenage rebellions. It was this institutional indifference that allowed Corll to operate for so long, to claim so many victims, to perfect his methods of abduction, torture, and murder. But even the most careful predator eventually makes mistakes, and Corll's came on August 8th, 1973, during what would prove to be his final night of freedom. He had invited several teenagers to his house on Lamar Street in Pasadena, including Henley and 2 other young people. At some point during the evening, Corll announced his intention to rape and kill all 3 of his guests. It was a moment that revealed the true extent of his madness, his complete disconnection from any sense of human empathy or rational thought. Henley, who had participated in so many murders, who had helped lure so many victims to their deaths, finally found himself facing the same fate he had helped deliver to others. In that moment, something snapped, whether it was self-preservation, a sudden awakening of conscience, or simply the realization that his usefulness to Corll had come to an end, Henley grabbed a .22 caliber pistol and shot Corll 6 times, killing him instantly. When police arrived at the scene, they found Henley standing over Corll's body, and what he told them changed everything. Not only had he killed Corll in self-defense, but he could lead them to the bodies of dozens of victims. Over the next several days, in temperatures that reached well over 100 degrees, investigators followed Henley and Brooks to 3 separate burial sites around the Houston area. The boat storage shed was a scene that haunted everyone who witnessed it. 17 bodies were unearthed from the dirt floor, some wrapped in plastic, others simply buried naked in shallow graves. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of decomposition, lime, and the lingering odors of torture and death. Investigators found evidence of the systematic nature of Corll's crimes, including electrical cords with alligator clips that had been used to torture victims, and personal effects that told the stories of young lives cut short. Additional graves were found at High Island Beach, where 7 more bodies were discovered buried in the sand, and near Lake Sam Rayburn, where 4 more victims were located. Each excavation revealed new horrors, new evidence of the systematic nature of Corll's crimes, and new questions about how such a massive killing spree could have gone undetected for so long. The investigation revealed the true scope of what became known as the Houston mass murders, at the time the worst case of serial killing in American history. 28 victims were confirmed, though investigators believed the true number might be higher. The oldest victim was 20, the youngest just 13. They had been students and dropouts, runaways, and honor roll kids, but they had all shared the same terrible fate of crossing paths with Dean Corll. The aftermath was devastating for the families involved and for the city of Houston itself. Parents who had been told their children were runaways suddenly learned the horrible truth about their fates. The Houston Police Department faced intense criticism for their handling of the missing persons cases, for their willingness to write off young people as unworthy of serious investigation. The social services system that had failed to protect vulnerable children came under scrutiny, and the entire community was forced to confront the reality that evil had been living among them, wearing the face of a neighbor. Henley and Brooks were both tried and convicted for their roles in the murders. Henley received 6 consecutive life sentences for 6 murders, though investigators believed he had participated in many more. Brooks was convicted of 1 murder and also received a life sentence. Both men became figures of intense public fascination and revulsion, seen simultaneously as victims of Corll's manipulation and as willing participants in some of the most heinous crimes in American history. Today, 50 years after the Houston mass murders came to light, 27 of Corll's 28 known victims have been identified. The last, known only as John Doe, 1973, remains nameless despite decades of effort by forensic experts and investigators. He was found wearing swim trunks and a peace sign t-shirt, personal effects that spoke to the era and the youthful hope that Corll had extinguished. His unidentified status serves as a reminder that even in death, some of Corll's victims remain lost to history, their stories untold, their families still searching for answers. The story of Dean Corll forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the capacity for evil that can exist behind the most ordinary facades, and about the social systems that either protect vulnerable children or fail them catastrophically. Corll wasn't born a monster, he was made one through a combination of childhood trauma, social isolation, and the gradual erosion of empathy that can transform a damaged human being into a predator of unimaginable cruelty. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Houston mass murders isn't just what Corll did, but how easily he was able to do it. He operated in plain sight for 3 years, killing children in a major American city while authorities looked the other way. He recruited accomplices from among the very population he was targeting, turning victims into perpetrators in a cycle of abuse that demonstrated the psychological sophistication of his methods. The case stands as a monument to the darkness that can flourish when society chooses to ignore its most vulnerable members, when institutions fail in their basic responsibilities, and when evil is allowed to operate unchecked. Dean Corll may be dead, but the lessons of his crimes remain painfully relevant, a reminder that the price of indifference is measured in young lives lost, families destroyed, and communities forever scarred by the knowledge of what one man was capable of doing when no one was watching. In the end, the Candyman's sweetness was revealed to be nothing more than bait, his kindness a mask for cruelty so profound it challenges our understanding of human nature itself. His victims, known now as Houston's Lost Boys, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a crime that shocked the nation, but as individual human beings whose potential was stolen, whose futures were erased, and whose deaths serve as an eternal warning about the monsters that can hide among us, offering candy to children while planning their destruction. In the quiet suburbs of Sacramento, California, in the summer of 1976, something evil began to stir. Women started calling the police, their voices trembling, reporting break-ins that felt different, too deliberate, too personal. The intruder didn't just take valuables, he studied them. He learned their routines, their vulnerabilities, their deepest fears. And then he came back. What these women didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that their nightmare had a face that walked among them every day, hidden behind a badge and the trust of an entire community. For over a decade, one man would terrorize California, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and shattered souls that would remain unsolved for nearly 40 years. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo, and until 2018, he was the ghost that law enforcement couldn't catch. The predator who vanished like smoke. The monster who wore the mask of respectability so perfectly that even his own family never suspected the darkness that lived inside him. Born on November the 8th, 1945, in Bath, New York, Joseph DeAngelo seemed destined for an ordinary life. His father was an army sergeant, his mother a housewife, and by all outward appearances, he was just another American boy growing up in the post-war era. But beneath the surface, something was already broken. Those who knew DeAngelo as a child would later recall a boy who seemed different, distant, cold. His sister would eventually reveal that their father was violent and that Joseph had witnessed traumatic events that no child should ever see. Whether these early experiences planted the seeds of what he would become, or whether something darker was already lurking in his DNA, remains a question that haunts those who study his case. What we do know is that by the time DeAngelo reached adulthood, he had learned to wear masks. The first mask was respectability. In 1973, he became a police officer in Exeter, California, sworn to protect and serve the very community he would soon begin to terrorize. It was the perfect cover for a predator learning to hunt. The crimes began slowly, almost experimentally. In 1973 and 1974, the small town of Visalia was plagued by a series of burglaries unlike anything law enforcement had seen before. The burglar didn't just steal, he ransacked homes with methodical precision, searching through personal belongings, taking photographs, and leaving behind an eerie sense that he had been watching, waiting, learning. They called him the Visalia Ransacker, and he committed over 100 burglaries before seemingly vanishing into thin air. What police didn't realize was that he hadn't disappeared, he had simply moved on to something far worse. In June 1976, the Sacramento area experienced its first attack by a predator who would come to be known as the East Area Rapist. A young woman, alone in her home, was awakened by a flashlight shining in her eyes. A masked figure stood over her bed, his voice calm and terrifyingly controlled. He told her exactly what he was going to do, and that if she made a sound, he would kill her. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was something calculated, rehearsed, perfected. The attacker had clearly been inside the house before, knew the layout, knew her routine. He had brought rope, handcuffs, and a knife. He had planned every detail with the precision of someone who had done this before. Over the next 3 years, the East Area Rapist would commit over 50 attacks in the Sacramento area alone. His methods were always the same, yet terrifyingly effective. He would stalk his victims for days or weeks beforehand, learning their schedules, studying their homes, sometimes even breaking in to leave behind ligatures that he would later use to bind them. When he struck, it was always in the dead of night. He would wake his victims with a blinding flashlight, his face hidden behind a ski mask. If there was a man in the house, he would tie him up first, often placing dishes on his back so that any movement would create noise and alert the attacker. Then he would take the woman to another room and spend hours terrorizing her, raping her, and describing in graphic detail what he would do if she ever told anyone. But perhaps most chilling of all were the phone calls. Months, sometimes years after his attacks, victims would receive calls from a man whose voice they recognized with bone-deep terror. He would whisper threats, describe details from their assault that only he could know, and promise that he was still watching them. The East Area Rapist seemed to feed on fear itself. He wasn't just committing crimes, he was destroying lives, piece by piece, attack by attack, and all the while, Joseph DeAngelo was living his double life with chilling normalcy. During the day, he was Officer DeAngelo, responding to calls, writing reports, and earning the trust of his community. At night, he was something else entirely. In 1979, DeAngelo's law enforcement career came to an abrupt end when he was caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a store. It was a minor crime that cost him his job, but it may have also saved countless lives, or so investigators thought. What they didn't know was that DeAngelo hadn't stopped, he had simply evolved. In 1979, as the East Area Rapist attacks mysteriously ceased in Northern California, a new horror began to emerge in Southern California. Bodies started appearing, and the killer behind them was unlike anything law enforcement had ever encountered. They called him the original Night Stalker, and his crimes were even more terrifying than those of the East Area rapist. He would break into homes where couples lived, binding and terrorizing both victims before murdering them with a brutality that seemed to increase with each attack. Between 1979 and 1986, he killed at least 13 people, each murder more savage than the last. The killer's methods were becoming increasingly sophisticated. He would case neighborhoods for weeks, sometimes months before selecting his targets. He seemed to know exactly when couples would be alone, when they would be most vulnerable. He would cut phone lines, disable security systems, and leave behind a level of violence that suggested he was no longer content with simply terrorizing his victims. He wanted to destroy them completely. For investigators, the most frustrating aspect of these crimes was how the killer seemed to anticipate their every move. He never left useful fingerprints, never left behind substantial physical evidence, and always seemed to vanish without a trace. It was as if he understood exactly how police investigations worked, almost as if he had once been one of them. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the original Night Stalker's crimes was how personal they were. This wasn't random violence. This was targeted, planned, and executed with a level of precision that suggested the killer derived genuine pleasure from the planning process itself. He would often spend time in the homes after the murders, eating food, drinking beer, and in some cases, even calling people he knew to establish alibis while standing next to his victims' bodies. For 7 years, the original Night Stalker terrorized Southern California, and then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished. The last known murder occurred in 1986, and then silence. For investigators, it was as if the killer had simply stopped existing. What they didn't know was that Joseph DeAngelo had simply returned to his mask of normalcy. He had gotten married, started a family, and taken a job at a grocery warehouse. To his neighbors, his co-workers, and even his own family, he was just Joe, a quiet, unremarkable man who kept to himself and seemed to live a perfectly ordinary life. For over 30 years, DeAngelo successfully maintained this facade. He went to work every day, attended family gatherings, and played the role of the suburban grandfather with an Oscar-worthy performance. All the while, the families of his victims lived with the knowledge that their loved one's killer was still out there, somewhere, possibly living a normal life, while they struggled with decades of grief and unanswered questions. It wasn't until 2001 that investigators made the connection that would eventually lead to DeAngelo's downfall. DNA analysis revealed that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. Suddenly, law enforcement realized they weren't dealing with two separate criminals. They were hunting one man who had committed over 50 rapes and 13 murders across multiple counties over more than a decade. The revelation sparked renewed interest in the case, particularly from true crime writer Michelle McNamara, who became obsessed with tracking down the killer she dubbed the Golden State Killer. McNamara spent years researching the case, building detailed timelines, and developing theories about the killer's identity and methods. Her work brought new attention to the crimes and helped keep the case in the public eye. Tragically, McNamara died in 2016 before she could see her work completed, but her research had planted seeds that would eventually bear fruit. In 2018, investigators used a breakthrough technique called genetic genealogy to identify distant relatives of the Golden State Killer through public DNA databases. By building family trees and cross-referencing them with the geographic and temporal patterns of the crimes, investigators were able to narrow their focus to a single suspect. Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old retiree living quietly in the Sacramento suburbs. On April the 24th, 2018, investigators surrounded DeAngelo's modest home and arrested him without incident. For the first time in over 40 years, the Golden State Killer had a face, and that face belonged to a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the communities that had been terrorized by DeAngelo's crimes. Here was a man who had successfully evaded capture for decades, not because he was some criminal mastermind, but because he understood exactly how investigations worked. His background in law enforcement had given him insights into police procedures, evidence collection, and investigative techniques that allowed him to stay one step ahead of those hunting him. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how completely ordinary DeAngelo appeared to be. This wasn't the stereotypical image of a serial killer. This was a man who had coached youth baseball, attended church functions, and seemed to be living the American dream. His neighbors described him as quiet but unremarkable, the kind of person you might pass on the street without giving a second thought. During his interrogation, DeAngelo initially tried to maintain his mask of innocence, but when left alone in the interrogation room, investigators recorded him whispering to himself, "I did all those things. I destroyed all those lives. So now I've got to pay the price." In June 2020, at the age of 74, Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to dozens of rapes and hundreds of burglaries. As part of his plea agreement, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, finally bringing an end to one of the most prolific and terrifying crime sprees in American history. But the true horror of Joseph DeAngelo's story isn't just in the crimes he committed, it's in how successfully he managed to hide in plain sight for over 4 decades. He was a respected member of his community, a family man, someone who understood exactly how to project an image of normalcy while harboring the darkest of secrets. DeAngelo's case serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a badge, attends family barbecues, and waves to neighbors while mowing the lawn. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who understand exactly how to become invisible, not by hiding in the shadows, but by blending seamlessly into the light. Today, Joseph DeAngelo sits in a prison cell, finally paying the price for decades of unspeakable crimes. But for the survivors of his attacks and the families of his victims, his capture represents not just justice, but also a kind of closure that many had given up hope of ever finding. The nightmare that began in Sacramento in 1976 is finally over, but its legacy serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear most are the ones who live right next door. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror lasted over a decade, but his ability to hide in plain sight lasted for nearly half a century. In the end, it wasn't superior detective work that brought him down. It was the simple fact that science had finally evolved to the point where his secrets could no longer be hidden. Joseph DeAngelo had always been a student of human behavior, but he had failed to account for the one thing he couldn't control: the relentless march of progress and the determination of those who refused to let his victims be forgotten. In the summer of 1987, in the sleepy beach town of Ocean City, Florida, residents thought they knew their neighbors. They thought they understood the rhythm of their small community where tourists came to enjoy white sand beaches and local kids worked at family restaurants. But what they didn't know was that one of those local kids was about to become one of Florida's most terrifying serial killers. His name was Frank Athen Walls, and if you've never heard that name before, it's because his story has been buried in the shadows of Florida's criminal history. Unlike the flashy killers who dominate headlines, Frank was invisible, methodical, and utterly ruthless. For 2 years, he stalked the beaches and mobile home parks of Okaloosa County, leaving behind a trail of bodies that would shock even seasoned investigators. Frank was born on October 12, 1967, in Ocean City, a small coastal community where everyone knew everyone else's business. But despite growing up surrounded by neighbors and familiar faces, Frank was becoming something dark and dangerous, hidden in plain sight. From an early age, he displayed troubling behavior that should have been warning signs, but were dismissed or overlooked by a community that preferred to look the other way. By the time he was a teenager, Frank had already accumulated a disturbing criminal record. He was caught burglarizing homes, peeping into windows where young women lived, and in one particularly chilling incident, abusing animals. These weren't the typical teenage pranks of a rebellious kid. These were the calculated actions of someone learning to hurt, to control, to dominate. But what made Frank truly dangerous wasn't just his willingness to commit crimes. It was his ability to blend in. While his neighbors saw a quiet young man who worked as a dishwasher at Quincy's restaurant, Frank was methodically planning something far more sinister. He shared a trailer with a roommate named Thomas Animal Farnham, who would later tell investigators that Frank often talked about disturbing fantasies involving rape and murder. Even more unsettling was Frank's social circle. He was dating the stepdaughter of Mark Reba, a man who would later gain his own dark notoriety as a confessed serial killer. It was as if Frank was drawn to others who shared his twisted worldview, creating a network of violence hiding beneath the surface of this small Florida town. March the 26th, 1985. Frank was 17 years old and performing community service on Okaloosa Island for his previous crimes. It was a beautiful spring day, the kind that brings tourists and locals alike to Florida's pristine beaches. 19-year-old Tommy Lou Whidden, a junior college student, had decided to spend the afternoon sunbathing, unaware that she was being watched. Frank had been working his community service when he spotted Tommy alone on the beach. Something inside him snapped, or perhaps it was simply the moment he had been waiting for. He approached her quietly, brandishing a knife, and in broad daylight, in full view of anyone who might have been watching, he slashed her throat and left her to bleed out on the sand. Then, as if the murder was just another errand to complete, Frank stole Tommy's car and drove away. Her body was discovered that evening by a passerby, and her stolen vehicle was found the next day, abandoned behind a random building. For Frank, it had been almost effortless. No one suspected the quiet dishwasher from Quincy's. No one connected him to the brutal murder of an innocent college student. For 18 months, Frank resumed his normal life. He went to work, interacted with his roommate, and to all outward appearances seemed like any other young man in Ocean City. But inside, something had awakened. The taste of killing had satisfied him in a way nothing else ever had, and he was already planning his next attack. September 16th, 1986. Frank struck again, this time in the nearby town of Wright. His victim was 24-year-old Cynthia Sue Condra, a mother of 3 who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Frank stabbed her 21 times, a frenzied attack that revealed the depth of his rage and violence. He left her body on the side of a road like discarded trash, then disappeared back into his routine life. The local police investigated both murders, but they had no reason to connect them. They seemed like random acts of violence, the kind of senseless crimes that occasionally plagued small towns. There was no pattern they could identify, no suspect who appeared in both cases. Frank had chosen his victims carefully, ensuring there were no witnesses and no connections that could lead back to him. But Frank wasn't satisfied with 2 murders. The violence was escalating, and his need to kill was becoming more frequent and more brutal. On May 20th, 1987, he decided to try something different. Instead of attacking someone in public, he would break into their home. 47-year-old Audrey Geeges lived alone in a mobile home on Duval Street, just a block away from where Frank lived with his roommate. She worked at a local Kel-Tec facility and lived a quiet, solitary life. To Frank, she represented the perfect victim, isolated, vulnerable, and close enough that he could study her routines. Frank broke into Audrey's trailer sometime between late Tuesday evening and early Wednesday morning. What happened inside that mobile home was so brutal that even investigators who had seen countless crime scenes were shaken. Frank raped Audrey, tortured her, and then stabbed her to death. But something about the murder bothered him. Perhaps he felt he had left too much evidence, or maybe he simply wanted to ensure she was dead. Whatever the reason, Frank made the chilling decision to return to the scene and mutilate her body further. The discovery of Audrey's body sent shockwaves through the Ocean City community. This wasn't a random attack on a beach or a roadside murder. This was a predator who had invaded someone's home, their most sacred space, and turned it into a scene of unimaginable horror. Residents began locking their doors for the first time in years, and parents kept their children closer. But Frank wasn't finished. In fact, he was just getting started on what would become his most notorious and brutal crime, July 22nd, 1987. The early morning hours were still and quiet in the Greenwood Mobile Home Park. Most residents were asleep, including 20-year-old Edward K. Alger, an airman stationed at nearby Eglin Air Force Base, and his girlfriend, 22-year-old Anne Louise Peterson. They had no idea that Frank Walls was watching their trailer, studying the layout, planning his next attack. Frank didn't choose this couple randomly. He had been observing the mobile home park, learning the routines of its residents, identifying those who would make suitable victims. Edward and Anne were young, isolated, and lived in a trailer that was somewhat removed from the others. To Frank, they represented the perfect opportunity. Sometime after midnight, Frank broke into their trailer. But unlike his previous attacks, this time he didn't want to simply kill and leave. He wanted to control, to terrorize, to make his victims experience maximum fear before they died. So instead of attacking immediately, Frank deliberately knocked over a fan, creating noise that would wake the sleeping couple. When Edward and Anne emerged from their bedroom to investigate the sound, they found Frank waiting for them, armed with a knife and a gun. What happened next revealed the true depth of Frank's sadistic nature. He forced Anne to tie up Edward's hands and ankles, making her an unwilling participant in her boyfriend's restraint. Then he tied her up as well, leaving both victims helpless and terrified. But Edward wasn't going to go quietly. Despite being bound, he managed to loosen his restraints and launch himself at Frank, fighting desperately to protect himself and Anne. It was an act of incredible courage, and for a moment, it seemed like he might succeed. Edward even managed to bite Frank's hand, causing him to drop his knife. Frank, however, was prepared for resistance. When the knife fell, he pulled out his gun and shot Edward 3 times in the head, execution style. The young airman who had tried so bravely to defend his girlfriend died instantly. Frank then turned his attention to Anne. He removed her gag, and in a moment that reveals the calculated cruelty of his nature, he told her exactly what had happened to Edward. He explained that he hadn't wanted to hurt them, but Edward's resistance had forced his hand. It was a lie designed to increase Anne's terror, to make her believe that her boyfriend's death was somehow her fault. What Frank did next was unspeakable. He sexually assaulted Anne while she was bound and helpless, then shot her in the head. When the first shot didn't kill her, Frank placed a pillow over her face and shot again, ensuring she was dead. Before leaving, Frank robbed the couple's trailer, stealing $200, a worn leather wallet, and an oscillating fan. It was as if the brutal double murder had been nothing more than a burglary gone wrong, a few $100s worth of items taken from people who would never need them again. The bodies were discovered the next day when Edward failed to report for duty at Eglin Air Force Base. His superior officer, Sergeant John Calloway, went to check on him and made the horrific discovery. The crime scene was so brutal that even experienced investigators were shaken. This wasn't just murder. It was torture, sadistic violence that seemed to serve no purpose other than Frank's own twisted satisfaction. But Frank had made a critical mistake. His roommate, Thomas Animal Farnham, had noticed Frank's increasingly erratic behavior following the murders. Farnham contacted the police and told them about Frank's disturbing conversations, his talk about rape and murder, and his strange actions in the days following the double homicide. When police arrived at Frank's trailer the day after the bodies were discovered, they found evidence that linked him directly to the crime scene. Items stolen from Edward and Anne's home were discovered in Frank's possession, and more importantly, Frank himself confessed to the murders. But what was most chilling about Frank's confession wasn't just the details of his crimes. It was his complete lack of remorse, his matter-of-fact description of how he had tortured and killed 5 innocent people. When investigators asked him why he had committed these murders, Frank simply said he didn't know, that he sometimes heard voices telling him to kill. Frank was arrested and charged with 10 different offenses related to the double murder. He was only 19 years old, but he had already proven himself to be one of Florida's most dangerous killers. At his trial, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Not only did he confess, but physical evidence tied him to multiple crime scenes. In 1988, Frank was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of Ann Peterson and to life in prison for the murder of Edward Alger. He was just 20 years old when he was sent to death row, making him one of the youngest killers ever to receive Florida's ultimate punishment. But Frank's story didn't end with his conviction. While he was on death row, advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to link him definitively to the murder of Audrey Gigi. Faced with this new evidence, Frank confessed to her murder as well, and to the killings of Tommy Lou Whitten and Cynthia Sue Condra. In total, Frank Walls had murdered 5 people between 1985 and 1987. His victims ranged in age from 19 to 47 and included a college student, a mother of 3, a solitary woman, and a young couple. They had nothing in common except that they had crossed paths with a killer who saw them as objects to be used and discarded. What makes Frank Walls particularly terrifying isn't just the brutality of his crimes, but the calculated nature of his violence. He wasn't a killer who struck in moments of passion or rage. He was methodical, patient, and utterly without conscience. He could murder someone in the morning and go to work that afternoon as if nothing had happened. Frank's case also revealed disturbing questions about how someone so young could become so evil. By the time he committed his first murder at 17, he had already demonstrated a pattern of escalating criminal behavior. He had been caught burglarizing, peeping, and abusing animals, all classic warning signs of a developing serial killer. Yet somehow, the system failed to recognize the danger he represented. Today, Frank Walls remains on death row at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. He is now 57 years old and has spent more than 3 decades awaiting execution. Over the years, his attorneys have filed numerous appeals, claiming he is intellectually disabled and therefore ineligible for the death penalty. However, multiple courts have rejected these claims, finding that Frank's IQ scores and adaptive behavior do not meet the criteria for intellectual disability. The community of Ocean City has never fully recovered from Frank's reign of terror. Residents still speak his name in hushed tones, and the trailer park where Edward and Ann were murdered has been torn down. Don Vinson, the chief investigator who arrested Frank, once joked that the killer would probably outlive him. Tragically, Vinson's prediction came true when the retired investigator died in 2022, while Frank remains alive on death row. Frank Walls represents something particularly chilling about human nature, the capacity for ordinary-looking people to commit extraordinary evil. He wasn't a monster in appearance or behavior. He was a quiet kid who worked at a local restaurant, someone you might have served you breakfast or sat next to in a movie theater. But beneath that unremarkable exterior was a predator who saw other human beings as nothing more than objects for his own gratification. His victims, Tommy Lou Whitten, Cynthia Sue Condra, Audrey Gigi, Edward Alger and Ann Peterson were real people with hopes, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them by a killer who felt nothing for their suffering. They deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as individuals whose lives mattered, whose deaths continue to impact their families and communities decades later. Frank Walls may not be a household name like some serial killers, but his crimes serve as a reminder that evil often hides in the most ordinary places, behind the most unremarkable faces. In small towns across America, there are probably others like Frank, watching, waiting, and planning. The only question is whether we'll recognize them in time to stop them. In the damp Pacific Northwest, where the sprawling industrial wasteland meets the murky waters of the Green River, a killer moved through the shadows for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't the kind of monster you'd expect. He didn't lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. He painted trucks by day, attended church on Sundays, and waved to his neighbors with a friendly smile. But Gary Leon Ridgway was hiding something darker than the gray Seattle skies. Between 1982 and 1998, this unassuming man would become America's deadliest convicted serial killer, claiming the lives of at least 49 women. Most people have never heard his name, overshadowed by the flashier killers who dominated headlines. But what makes Gary Ridgway truly terrifying isn't just the number of lives he stole, it's how ordinary he appeared, how seamlessly he blended into everyday life, and how methodically he hunted vulnerable women for decades while everyone around him remained oblivious. Born on February 18th, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, Gary's early life gave few hints of the monster he would become. His family moved to Washington State when he was young, settling in a rough neighborhood near Seattle's Pacific Highway. It was an area where runaways gathered, where desperation hung in the air like morning fog, and where predators learned to hunt. Gary was not a brilliant child. He struggled in school, earning poor grades and feeling constantly humiliated by his academic failures. What he lacked in intelligence, however, he made up for in cunning and patience. Even as a boy, he showed an unsettling ability to mask his true nature, to appear harmless while harboring darker impulses. His relationship with his mother was complex and troubling. Mary Ridgway was domineering and critical, creating an atmosphere of tension and resentment in their household. Gary would later claim that his mother's treatment of him contributed to his hatred of women, though many experts believe this was simply another manipulation, another lie in a lifetime of deception. After high school, Gary served briefly in the Navy and was stationed in the Philippines. It was there, far from home and oversight, that he first began acting on his violent fantasies. He later admitted to killing sex workers during his time overseas, though these crimes were never officially investigated or confirmed. When Gary returned to civilian life, he seemed to settle into normalcy. He got a job at Kenworth Truck Company, painting vehicles in a steady, methodical routine that would become his cover for the next 3 decades. He married, divorced, remarried, and divorced again. To his co-workers and neighbors, he appeared to be just another blue-collar worker trying to get by. But beneath this facade, something sinister was brewing. Gary frequented prostitutes regularly, despite his professed religious beliefs and his pattern of failed marriages. He claimed to hate the women he paid for sex, viewing them as dirty and worthless. This contradiction, this twisted relationship with sexuality and violence, would eventually explode into a killing spree that would terrorize the Pacific Northwest. The first confirmed victim appeared in July 1982. 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield had run away from her foster home, another vulnerable teenager lost in the system. Gary picked her up along the Pacific Highway, a stretch of road known for prostitution and desperation. He took her to a secluded area near the Green River, raped her, and then strangled her to death with her own jeans. Her body was discovered a week later, floating in the murky waters that would give Gary his infamous nickname. But this was just the beginning. Over the next few months, more bodies began appearing in and around the Green River. Young women, most of them sex workers or runaways, all bearing the same signature, strangulation marks around their necks. What made Gary particularly dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, but his methodical approach to murder. He developed a system, a routine that allowed him to operate undetected for years. He would cruise the Pacific Highway in his pickup truck, looking for vulnerable women. He was soft-spoken and non-threatening, often showing pictures of his young son to gain their trust. Gary would tell potential victims that he was just a lonely truck painter looking for companionship. He'd offer them money, a warm meal, or simply a ride somewhere safe. Many of the women who got into his truck were desperate, homeless, or struggling with addiction. They had few options and fewer people who cared about their whereabouts. Once he had them in his vehicle, Gary's would drive to his house in SeaTac, a modest home that became a killing ground. He would rape his victims, often multiple times, and then strangle them to death. His preferred method was manual strangulation, though he sometimes used ligatures. He claimed later that choking was personal and more rewarding than other methods of killing. After murdering his victims, Gary would load their bodies into his truck and drive to remote dump sites in the forests around Seattle. He chose these locations carefully, places where the bodies might not be discovered for months or years. But Gary had another, more disturbing reason for selecting these sites. He regularly returned to have sex with the decomposing corpses. This necrophilia was perhaps the most chilling aspect of Gary's crimes. He would revisit his victims' bodies repeatedly, sometimes bringing flowers or cheap jewelry as grotesque offerings. He treated these visits like dates, maintaining a twisted relationship with his victims long after their deaths. The efficiency of Gary's operation was terrifying. He killed with the same methodical precision he brought to his job painting trucks. He left no evidence at the crime scenes, often planting cigarette butts or gum wrappers from different brands to confuse investigators. He varied his dump sites and his methods just enough to avoid creating an obvious pattern. Between 1982 and 1984, Gary was killing at an almost unprecedented rate. More than 40 women disappeared during this period, their bodies scattered across the wilderness of King County. The media dubbed the unknown killer the Green River Killer, and a massive task force was assembled to catch him. But Gary was always one step ahead. He read every newspaper article about the investigation, watched every news report, and adjusted his methods accordingly. When he learned that investigators were looking for someone who knew the area well he began dumping bodies in different locations. When they theorized that the killer might have military experience, Gary downplayed his Navy service. Perhaps most disturbingly, Gary continued living his double life throughout this period. He remarried in 1985 to a woman named Judith Mawson, who had no idea she was sleeping next to a serial killer. He maintained his job, attended church regularly, and even participated in neighborhood watch programs. To everyone who knew him, Gary Ridgway was just an ordinary, unremarkable man. The investigation into the Green River killings became one of the longest and most expensive in American history. Detectives interviewed thousands of suspects, followed countless leads, and analyzed mountains of evidence. Gary's name came up repeatedly, but he always seemed to have explanations for his connections to the victims. In 1983, he was questioned about the disappearance of 18-year-old Marie Malvar, who had last been seen getting into a truck matching Gary's vehicle. When police arrived at his house, Gary was calm and cooperative. He denied knowing the victim and allowed officers to search his property. What they didn't know was that Gary had just finished burning evidence and hiding Marie's body in a location where it wouldn't be found for 20 years. Ted Bundy, the infamous serial killer who was on death row at the time, even offered to help with the Green River investigation. In letters to Detective Dave Reichert, Bundy suggested that the killer might be returning to the bodies to engage in necrophilia. He was right, but his insights weren't enough to catch Gary. After 1984, the frequency of Gary's killings decreased dramatically. He had begun to feel the pressure of the investigation and recognized that he needed to be more careful. He continued to murder sporadically throughout the 1980s and 1990s, but at a much slower pace. His last confirmed victim was killed in 1998, 16 years after his first. For nearly 2 decades, Gary Ridgway lived with the secret of his crimes. He watched as families searched for their missing daughters, as investigators grew frustrated with dead ends, and as the case gradually faded from public attention. He must have believed he had gotten away with it. But forensic science was advancing, and old evidence was being re-examined with new technology. In 2001, DNA testing finally linked Gary to several of his victims. Microscopic paint particles from his workplace, found on the clothing of his first victim back in 1982, provided additional evidence. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested at his workplace, finally ending one of America's longest unsolved serial killing sprees. The man who had terrorized the Pacific Northwest for 2 decades was led away in handcuffs, looking more like a confused grandfather than a ruthless killer. Even after his arrest, Gary continued to manipulate and deceive. He initially denied all charges, claiming he was innocent of any wrongdoing. Facing the possibility of execution, Gary eventually agreed to cooperate with authorities. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he confessed to 48 murders and agreed to help locate additional victims' remains. The plea hearing was a surreal experience, as this mild-mannered man calmly admitted to decades of horrific crimes. Gary's confessions revealed the full scope of his depravity. He described his victims in cold, clinical terms, referring to them as my property and expressing no remorse for their deaths. He claimed that killing prostitutes was his career and that he chose them because he believed they wouldn't be missed. When asked why he killed so many women, Gary gave various explanations that seemed calculated to gain sympathy or attention. He blamed his mother, his failed marriages, and his religious beliefs. But the truth was simpler and more chilling. Gary Ridgway killed because he enjoyed it. The power, the control, the ability to decide who lived and died, these were his true motivations. In 2003, Gary was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Additional victims were discovered over the years, bringing his confirmed total to 49 murders. But Gary himself claimed to have killed many more, perhaps as many as 70 or 80 women. The true number may never be known. What makes Gary Ridgway's case particularly disturbing is how unremarkable he appeared to everyone around him. His co-workers described him as quiet and reliable. His neighbors saw him as friendly and helpful. Even his wives never suspected the truth about the man they shared a bed with. This ordinariness is perhaps Gary's most frightening legacy. He proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can be the quiet man next door, the reliable employee, the helpful neighbor. They can hide in plain sight for decades, carrying out unimaginable horrors while maintaining a facade of normalcy. The victims of the Green River Killer were among society's most vulnerable members. Many were teenagers who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. Others were women struggling with addiction or mental illness. They were mothers, daughters, and sisters who deserved so much better than the fate Gary gave them. For their families, Gary's capture brought both relief and anguish. Finally, they had answers about what happened to their loved ones. But those answers came with the terrible knowledge of how they had suffered, how they had been discarded like trash in the wilderness around Seattle. Today, Gary Ridgway sits in a Washington state prison, serving his life sentences. At 75 years old, he will never see freedom again. Occasionally, he offers to help investigators locate additional victims' remains, always dangling the possibility of more confessions in exchange for privileges or attention. The case of the Green River Killer changed how law enforcement approaches serial investigations. It highlighted the importance of DNA evidence, the value of interdisciplinary cooperation, and the need to take seriously crimes against society's most vulnerable members. But perhaps most importantly, Gary Ridgway's story serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears the most ordinary face. In a world where we expect monsters to look monstrous, the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal. They live among us, work beside us, and smile at us in grocery stores, all while harboring the darkest of secrets. The Green River ran red with blood for nearly 2 decades, and the man responsible looked exactly like someone you might trust with your life. That may be the most terrifying truth of all. In the scorching farmlands of Northern California, where the earth bakes hard under an unforgiving sun and migrant workers toil in endless rows of crops, there emerged a darkness so methodical, so quietly devastating, that it would rewrite the very definition of mass murder in America. But this story doesn't begin with the discovery of bodies buried in shallow graves. It begins with a man who seemed to embody the American dream, yet harbored within him an abyss that would swallow 25 innocent lives. The spring of 1971 should have been like any other in Yuba City, California. The peach orchards were blooming, the fields were ready for planting, and thousands of migrant workers were arriving to begin another season of backbreaking labor. What no one could have imagined was that among these workers walked a predator whose crimes would shock a nation and expose the tragic vulnerability of society's most forgotten souls. Juan Corona was born on February 7th, 1934, in San Antonio de los Moran, Ayutla, Jalisco, Mexico. His early life was marked by the grinding poverty that defined rural Mexico in the 1930s. Like so many others, he dreamed of a better life across the border, where the fields of California promised opportunity for those willing to work. In 1950, at age 16, Juan illegally crossed into the United States through the California border, following the footsteps of his 4 brothers and 1 sister. He was just another face in the endless stream of workers who sustained America's agricultural industry, invisible to most, essential to all. For years, Juan labored in the fields, picking fruit, harvesting vegetables, slowly learning the rhythms of American agricultural life. But something was festering beneath the surface of this quiet, hard-working man. Family members and others said he was traumatized by a deadly flood that struck the Sacramento Valley in 1955, killing 37 people in Yuba City. The flood became a turning point in Juan's psychological landscape. He believed that everyone in this area has drowned in the flood, his brother Natividad wrote in a 1956 petition for Juan's institutionalization. What should have been a natural disaster became in Juan's deteriorating mind a revelation that the living were actually the dead, that the world around him was populated by ghosts. In January 1956, after what was thought to be a schizophrenic episode, Natividad had Corona committed to DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California, where he was diagnosed with schizophrenic reaction, paranoid type. He received 23 electroconvulsive therapy sessions before he was declared recovered and released 3 months later. Like so many patients of that era, Juan was simply medicated, shocked, and released back into society with little understanding of his underlying condition. He was deported to Mexico upon his release. In 1962, Corona was given a green card and returned to the United States legally, where he was regarded as a hard worker with schizophrenic episodes and a violent temper. But Juan's return to America marked the beginning of a new chapter. He became a licensed labor contractor in charge of hiring fruit ranch workers. This position gave him something he had never possessed before: power. Suddenly, he controlled the livelihoods of dozens of men, mostly fellow Mexican immigrants, day laborers, and society's most vulnerable workers. These men lived on the margins of American society. They were transients, drifters, men whose disappearance might go unnoticed for weeks or months. His line of work meant that Corona dealt with a lot of destitute men with no family in the area. These workers were often elderly, alcoholic, and on the margins of the community. This meant that their absence often went unnoticed, making them the perfect targets for a serial killer. As Juan established himself in the community, his public persona couldn't have seemed more respectable. He married, had children, attended church, and built a successful business. To his neighbors, he was the embodiment of the immigrant success story. But behind this facade something dark was taking shape. In March 1970, he was again admitted to DeWitt for treatment. In March 1971, he applied for and was denied welfare. The pressures were mounting, and whatever psychological barriers had contained his violent impulses were beginning to crumble. The first hint that something was terribly wrong came on May 19th, 1971, when a farm owner who had used Corona to contract field workers noticed a freshly dug hole in his peach orchard, which was filled the next day. Goro Kagehiro, who had hired Corona to supply field workers, noticed a freshly filled hole about 4 feet deep, 5 feet long, and 2 feet wide in his Sutter County orchard. Something about that hole disturbed Kagehiro. It was the perfect size and shape for something no one wanted to contemplate. He called the sheriff's office. Under the soil was the body of laborer Kenneth Whitaker. But this discovery was merely the beginning of a horror that would unfold over the following weeks, like a nightmare coming to life. 6 days later, a second body was discovered in a shallow grave at a nearby ranch, and a third body was found close to the Feather River. Near the third body, a deputy recovered 2 meat market receipts bearing the name of Juan Corona. What followed was one of the most intensive and grisly excavations in American criminal history. By June 4th, the day of the search's conclusion, the number of known victims was 25. This was twice the body count of the Boston Strangler, the most prolific known American serial killer up to that point. The crime scenes revealed a level of methodical brutality that horrified even seasoned investigators. Juan Corona's method of murder was a particularly brutal one. Save for one victim who was shot, he repeatedly stabbed people in the chest. All of his victims were buried face up, with their arms above their heads and their shirts over their faces. Occasionally, their corpses were further desecrated by having their pants pulled down to their ankles. But the horror extended beyond simple murder. As authorities uncovered more and more bodies, a strange, grisly pattern emerged. Beyond succumbing to a deep puncture to the chest, Corona's victims also bore significant facial mutilation. The men's heads, as it appeared, had been brutally hacked at by either a machete or large knife shortly after their death. Bizarrely, Corona also carved a cross on the back of each victim's skull. Even more disturbing was the sexual component of the crimes. Aside from being stabbed and mutilated, Juan Corona's victims were also sodomized prior to their deaths. Believed to be a sexual sadist, Corona developed a pattern of picking a victim, digging a hole, and then sexually assaulting them prior to their murder. After officers unearthed 6 additional bodies, Corona, then 37, was arrested on May 26, 1971. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Evidence indicating his guilt was discovered and seized, such as 2 blood-stained knives, a machete, a pistol, and blood-stained clothing. There was also a work ledger that contained 34 names and dates, including 7 of the known victims. The ledger came to be referred to as a death list. All of the victims had been hired through Corona's labor contracting business or had been seen with him. The scope of his methodical planning became clear as investigators realized that Juan had been using his position of authority to select and isolate his victims. The trial that followed was a media sensation, though one tinged with an uncomfortable truth about whose lives society deemed worthy of attention. The basic assumption was that the victims were Mexican immigrant farm laborers, writes crime historian Peter Vronsky. That immediately put a damper on any interest the newspaper reading and TV watching public might have had. Corona was convicted of 25 counts of first-degree murder in 1973. At the time of his conviction, he was the deadliest known American serial killer, yet his name would soon fade from public memory, overshadowed by more sensational killers whose victims came from communities society valued more highly. An appellate court overturned the conviction in 1978 on the basis of incompetent legal representation and granted him a new trial. The second trial brought new revelations about the Corona family's dark history. Around the time of the murders, Juan's half-brother, Natividad Corona, mysteriously fled from his home in Marysville, California, allegedly taking refuge in Mexico. Natividad had owned a restaurant called the Guadalajara Cafe, and he had just been sued by a former patron for $250,000. The plaintiff in that suit alleged he had been brutally attacked by Natividad with a machete in the restaurant's men's room after rebuffing his sexual advances. Corona's defense posited that the real murderer of the ranch workers was most likely his brother, Natividad Corona, a known homosexual who was accused of attacking Romero Raya with a machete-like weapon at his cafe in Marysville, and after losing the lawsuit Raya filed, had fled back to his native Mexico. Despite these attempts to shift blame, in 1982, he was again found guilty on all counts. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, the pattern too clear, the methodical nature of the crimes too obviously the work of one man. For decades, Juan Corona maintained his silence from behind prison walls. It wasn't until a parole hearing in 2011 that Corona, then 77 and suffering from dementia, finally confessed. He did admit to the killings, said Sutter County Assistant District Attorney Jana McClung. Corona told a psychiatrist in July that he killed the transients, who had been hired as temporary farm laborers because they had been trespassing. Even in confession, Corona raised more questions than he answered. Corona's testimony Monday included details about 2 victims whose descriptions did not match 25 bodies that Sutter County Sheriff's detectives uncovered in shallow graves during late spring in 1971. He said he used a kitchen knife to kill his first victim, and he cut himself doing it, said McClung. Corona died on March 4th, 2019, at age 85 in a hospital outside Corcoran State Prison. 14 of Corona's 25 victims, including 4 who were never identified, are buried in a common grave in the community of Sutter, just west of Yuba City. An inscription on the grave marker reads, "Here lie 14 men of the sod, 4 of them known only to God." The case of Juan Corona represents something profoundly disturbing about how society values human life. Despite the astounding victim toll, the press quickly lost interest. Corona's killing spree appears to have launched a golden age of serial murders. Crime historian Peter Vronsky notes, if there was a ground zero in the serial killer epidemic to come, then Juan Corona fits the bill. Here was a man who killed more people than Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, or John Wayne Gacy in their individual sprees, yet his name remains largely unknown. His victims were men society had written off as expendable, living in the shadows, surviving day to day in a world that saw them only as cheap labor. Juan Corona's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about which victims matter and which killers we remember. He understood that certain people could disappear without anyone caring, that certain lives were considered disposable. In the agricultural valleys of California, where migrant workers labored in anonymity, Juan Corona found the perfect hunting ground. What made Corona truly terrifying wasn't just his body count, but how perfectly he exploited society's blind spots. He appeared to be a successful businessman, a family man, a pillar of the immigrant community. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade was a predator who understood exactly which victims society wouldn't miss. The case reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it wears the mask of respectability, operates within the structures of legitimate authority, and preys upon those whom society has already forgotten. Juan Corona didn't just kill 25 men, he exposed the brutal reality that some lives are deemed more valuable than others, and that monsters often hide in plain sight, protected by our own prejudices and indifference. In the end, Juan Corona's legacy is not just one of murder, but of a society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members. His victims were killed twice, once by his hands and once by our collective indifference to their lives. That may be the most chilling truth of all. In the quiet streets of Santa Cruz, California, where redwood trees cast long shadows and the ocean breeze carries whispers of peace, something sinister was awakening. The year was 1972, and while most of America was focused on the Vietnam War and the Cultural Revolution sweeping the nation, a young man named Herbert Mullin was preparing to save the world through the most horrific means imaginable. His name was Herbert William Mullin, and if you've never heard of him, there's a reason. His story doesn't fit the narrative we're comfortable with. He wasn't born into poverty, wasn't abused as a child, wasn't some obvious monster lurking in the shadows. In fact, by all accounts, Herbert Mullin was supposed to be successful. He was voted most likely to succeed by his high school classmates, played varsity football, and had a steady girlfriend. He came from a respectable middle-class family in California, where his father worked as a furniture salesman and war hero from World War II. But what makes Herbert Mullin truly terrifying isn't what he was, it's what he became. Between October 1972 and February 1973, this seemingly normal young man would murder 13 innocent people, including children, elderly victims, and even a priest. His victims ranged in age from 4 to 73, and they had absolutely nothing in common except one thing. They were unlucky enough to cross paths with a killer who believed their deaths would prevent earthquakes from destroying California. Herbert was born on April 18, 1947, in Salinas, California. The date would later hold profound significance for him, as it was the anniversary of the devastating 1906 San Francisco earthquake that killed over 3,000 people. In his twisted mind, this wasn't a coincidence, it was destiny. The Mullin family seemed like any other American household of the 1950s. His father, Martin William Bill Mullin, was a decorated World War II veteran who had earned respect in the community. He was stern but not abusive, the kind of father who taught his son how to shoot a gun and shared war stories from his service. Herbert's mother was a devoted homemaker, and he had an older sister. When Herbert was 5, the family moved from their farming community to San Francisco, and later to the picturesque town of Felton in Santa Cruz County. In high school, Herbert was everything parents hoped their children would be. He was popular, athletic, and academically capable. He played varsity football, had a circle of friends, and maintained a relationship with his girlfriend. Teachers saw him as bright and gentle-natured. His classmates admired him enough to vote him most likely to succeed. After graduating in 1965, he enrolled at Cabrillo College to study engineering and even considered following his father's footsteps into military service. But then everything changed. The summer after graduation, Herbert's best friend, Dean Richardson, was killed in a car accident. The tragedy shattered something fundamental inside Herbert's mind. Instead of processing his grief normally, he became obsessed with death and reincarnation. He built shrines to Dean in his bedroom, spending hours alone communing with what he believed was his friend's spirit. This was the moment when Herbert Mullin, the promising young man, began his descent into madness. The signs started small. Herbert began experimenting with drugs, first marijuana, then LSD and other hallucinogens. In the late 1960s, Santa Cruz was a hotbed of counterculture activity, where drugs were easily accessible and alternative spirituality flourished. Herbert threw himself into this world, adopting a hippie lifestyle that horrified his conservative military father. He explored yoga, meditation, macrobiotic diets, and even attempted to join a priesthood. He became increasingly paranoid and unpredictable. In 1968, Herbert confessed to his girlfriend that he thought he might be gay, effectively ending their relationship. His behavior became more erratic as he drifted through various mental institutions, never staying long enough to receive proper treatment. His family, desperate to understand what was happening to their once promising son, attributed his changes to drug use. After all, this was the height of the hippie movement, and many young people were experimenting with consciousness-altering substances. But drugs weren't the real culprit. Herbert was developing paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that would eventually consume his rational mind entirely. He began hearing voices, first whispers, then clear commands. These weren't the voices of his conscience or his imagination. They were as real to him as any conversation. The primary voice he heard belonged to his father, but not the living man, an omnipotent version who spoke to him telepathically, issuing orders that Herbert felt compelled to obey. By 1972, at age 25, Herbert had moved back in with his parents in Felton. He had become fixated on earthquakes, studying seismic patterns, and developing an elaborate delusion about their causes. Herbert believed that the Vietnam War had produced enough American deaths to act as blood sacrifices, preventing catastrophic earthquakes from destroying California. But as American involvement in Vietnam began winding down, Herbert became convinced that the natural balance was being disrupted. Without enough deaths to appease nature's destructive forces, California would face annihilation. In his delusional mind, Herbert believed he had been chosen as the designated leader of his generation, responsible for maintaining the cosmic balance through human sacrifice. His birthday, April 18th, the anniversary of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, wasn't coincidence, but proof of his divine mission. The voices in his head, particularly his father's, began commanding him to kill. On October 13th, 1972, Herbert Mullin committed his first murder. He drove his 1958 Chevy station wagon to a remote area and pretended to have car trouble, opening the hood to attract attention. When 55-year-old vagrant Lawrence Whitey White stopped to help, offering to fix the car in exchange for a ride, Herbert beat him to death with a baseball bat. He later claimed that White resembled the biblical figure Jonah and had sent him telepathic messages saying, "Hey man, pick me up and throw me over the boat. Kill me so that others will be saved." Herbert dragged White's body into the woods, where it was discovered the next day. The murder provided Herbert with a twisted sense of validation. He had followed the voice's commands and felt he was serving a greater purpose. But one death wasn't enough. The voices demanded more sacrifices. 11 days later, on October 24th, Herbert encountered Mary Margaret Guilfoyle, a young college student from Cabrillo College who was running late for an appointment. When Herbert offered her a ride, she accepted, not knowing she was climbing into a car with a killer. While driving, Herbert suddenly stabbed her in the chest, killing her instantly. But this murder was different. Herbert believed he needed to examine his victim's organs for evidence of environmental pollution, so he disemboweled her corpse, hanging her intestines from tree branches like grotesque decorations. Mary's body wasn't found for several months, and when it was discovered, investigators initially suspected it was the work of Edmund Kemper, another serial killer who was simultaneously terrorizing the Santa Cruz area. The coincidence of two serial killers operating in the same small city at the same time would confuse police for months. 4 days after killing Mary, on November 2nd, All Souls Day, Herbert drove to St. Mary's Catholic Church in Los Gatos. He entered the confessional booth and began telling Father Henri Tomé about his crimes. In Herbert's distorted reality, the 64-year-old priest volunteered to become his next sacrifice. Herbert stabbed Father Tomé to death right there in the confessional booth. A sacred space meant for redemption turned into a scene of horror. The killing spree continued into 1973. In January, Herbert attempted to join the United States Marine Corps, believing military service might provide a legal outlet for his urge to kill. He passed the physical and psychiatric examinations, but when recruiters discovered his extensive criminal record and history of bizarre behavior, he was rejected. Herbert interpreted this rejection as part of a vast conspiracy against him, further fueling his paranoid delusions. By this time, Herbert had stopped taking drugs entirely and began blaming all his problems on his past substance use. He decided that Jim Gianera, his former high school friend who had first introduced him to marijuana, was responsible for ruining his life. Herbert tracked down Gianera to a remote cabin in the Santa Cruz Mountains. When he confronted his old friend about providing him with drugs years earlier, Herbert wasn't satisfied with Gianera's response. He shot him dead. But Herbert wasn't finished. The voices commanded more deaths, and his killing spree escalated to its most horrific peak. On February 10th, 1973, Herbert went to a remote cabin where he knew another friend, Kathy Francis, was staying. When he arrived, he found not just Kathy, but an entire family, James and Joan Gianera, along with their two young children, 4-year-old Demon and 9-year-old Damon. In a frenzy of violence, Herbert shot and killed all 5 people, including the 2 innocent children who had done nothing but exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. 3 days later, on February 13th, 1973, Herbert's reign of terror finally ended. He was driving through Santa Cruz when he spotted a teenage boy walking along the street. Acting on impulse, Herbert shot at the boy, wounding but not killing him. Witnesses saw the shooting and immediately called police. When officers arrived, they found Herbert calmly sitting in his car, showing no signs of panic or remorse. When arrested, Herbert was surprisingly cooperative. He didn't try to deny his crimes or claim innocence. Instead, he explained his actions with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing their job. He told investigators he had killed 13 people to prevent earthquakes from destroying California. He described his victims not as human beings, but as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. The voices in his head, particularly his father's voice, had commanded these deaths, and Herbert had simply been following orders. The trial that followed was a circus of psychiatric evaluation and legal maneuvering. Herbert's defense team attempted to prove he was legally insane at the time of the murders, arguing that his paranoid schizophrenia prevented him from understanding right from wrong. Psychiatrists testified about his severe mental illness, describing a man completely disconnected from reality. But the prosecution argued that Herbert knew his actions were wrong, pointing to his attempts to hide evidence and his calculated approach to selecting victims. They painted him as a dangerous individual who used mental illness as an excuse for his crimes. During the trial, Herbert's behavior was erratic and disturbing. He would sometimes sit quietly, staring into space as if listening to voices only he could hear. Other times, he would make bizarre statements about cosmic conspiracies and his role as a chosen leader. He described himself as bi-everything, bisexual, bipolitical, bicultural, bispiritual, and even falsely claimed to be biracial. In the end, the jury found Herbert guilty of 10 murders. They rejected his insanity plea, determining that despite his mental illness, he was capable of understanding the nature of his crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison, avoiding the death penalty that many believed he deserved. While incarcerated, Herbert continued to live in his delusional world. He maintained that his murders had successfully prevented earthquakes and saved California from destruction. He showed no remorse for his victims, viewing their deaths as noble sacrifices for a greater cause. He was diagnosed with schizophrenic reaction, paranoid type, and spent his remaining years in various psychiatric facilities within the prison system. Ironically, Herbert ended up sharing a cell block with Edmund Kemper, the other serial killer who had been terrorizing Santa Cruz during the same time period. Kemper, who stood 6 feet 9 inches tall and had killed 8 people himself, found Herbert annoying and pathetic. He described Mullin as having a lot of pain inside, a lot of anguish inside, a lot of hate inside, directed at people he didn't even know. Kemper used behavioral modification techniques on Herbert, throwing water on him when he misbehaved and giving him peanuts when he was quiet. Herbert Mullin was denied parole 8 times over nearly 5 decades of imprisonment. Even in his final parole hearing in 2021, he continued to blame others for his actions, showing no genuine remorse for the 13 lives he had taken. The district attorney noted that Herbert had never shown true remorse for these brutal murders and continues to blame others for his actions. On August 18th, 2022, exactly 75 years after his birth on the anniversary of the San Francisco earthquake, Herbert Mullin died of natural causes while incarcerated at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton. His death marked the end of one of the most bizarre and tragic criminal cases in California history. The story of Herbert Mullin challenges our understanding of evil and mental illness. Here was a man who seemed destined for success, who came from a loving family and had every advantage in life. Yet something in his brain, whether genetic predisposition, environmental factors, or simply the cruel randomness of biology, transformed him into a monster. His 13 victims died not because of any action they had taken, but because they existed at the wrong moment in the path of a deeply disturbed individual who believed their deaths would save the world. Herbert Mullin represents the terrifying reality that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it grows quietly in the mind of someone who appears completely normal, nurtured by delusions and voices that sound as real as any human conversation. His story serves as a reminder that the line between sanity and madness, between ordinary citizens and dangerous killers, can be far thinner than we'd like to believe. In the end, Herbert Mullin didn't save California from earthquakes. He simply added to the sum total of human suffering in the world, leaving behind grieving families and a community forever scarred by his actions. His name may not be as well known as other serial killers, but his crimes were every bit as devastating to those whose lives he destroyed. He remains a chilling example of how mental illness, left untreated and combined with a perfect storm of circumstances, can transform a promising young man into one of the most dangerous predators in American criminal history.